Hello and welcome to the Front Row Back Row podcast. I am your host, Dr. Owen Campbell with Simplify Motion Physical Therapy in Phoenix, Arizona. And with me, as always, is Dr. Brian Wolf, owner of Evolution Physical Therapy in Stamford, Connecticut and Long Island. And I think you're in Darien too. You'd have to, I forget the, I
You got
Connecticut.
it, man. It's all good. Connecticut and New York, just go easy. I like your sexy invoice or your
The New
sexy.
York part.
That's your sexy library intro.
I
Very,
know.
very
So,
different.
yeah, when you're recording in a public library between patients because your home is 30 minutes each way. Yeah. So, if the listeners out there hear it be a little bit echoey, that is why I am using the resources of the Greater Phoenix Public Library.
Yep, exactly, exactly.
and when I normally talk, I'm all hyped up, and you'll get way more echo if I talk louder.
So it's just gonna have to talk like this. We're gonna have one of
Oh
those
no,
sexy podcasts,
it'll
one of
be
those weird
explicit.
talk. Nice,
It'll have the E on Apple Podcasts.
exactly. Nice.
All right. So speaking of E, we're talking about expense planning. Huh? See what I did there?
Oh no,
Um,
no.
so the topic of today's conversation is going to be about expense planning, and we all know that there's two different ways to make more money as a business. You either get a bunch of revenue, right, or you get lowering your expenses. So obviously you need revenue in both cases, but the business owner who what tries to outrun a big expense sheet by just getting a bunch of revenue, that's one way of doing it. Or you have the cost cutter, the penny pincher, micromanager who really looks at the expense side of it. And obviously, you kind of want to be somewhere in the middle, right? You want to have good revenue growth, but you also want to control those expenses. So, what we're going to do, and this kind of stems from a question I had for Brian. I've done 6 months now in my business. I now have low overhead, right? It's because I'm mobile, so all I have is what I fit in the back of my car and I take to patients. I don't have employees. I don't have some of the stuff that I don't take insurance, so I don't have a documentation system I have to pay for, billing, all that. And I say, okay, Brian, how do I spend my money? Right? I have money that I can actually deploy. And of course, we've talked on this podcast a lot about marketing, but there's a lot of other ways that we can look at our expense lines and say, okay, what's important, right? Because it's kind of like in a house, right? If you don't pay for the plumber, the house isn't very good,
Mhm.
right? But if you decide you want to have gold curtains everywhere, also expensive, but maybe not as necessary and won't get you living in the house, right? So these are the kind of questions I had for Brian of like, if I have this money now, what do I spend it on? And then, of course, later on, as I grow, I'm sure there'll be a lot more questions than answers. So, uh, this is what we're going to talk about today. And Brian, I really want to know, just answer my dang question. Like, what should I spend my money on? I have a few $1,000 now that I don't have to deploy to my own personal finances. What do I do?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where we've talked a little bit about marketing, and again, Owen, again, full transparency. Some these are real life issues that you go through, right? And so Owen and I were talking. He's like, "Hey, I'm going to go to this library to do the podcast today, so that." And again, he's like, "So I don't have to spend gas running back and forth, but also more importantly, the hidden expense there is your time, right? Like your time having running back home and forth, like, and not being able to do." Patients is a hidden expense. So there's also hidden expenses too. So I think like it just spurred my thought process of like you're already, Owen's already seeing the angles of how to think more efficiently, and that's what happens when you become a business owner. It's just like you're like, hey, I have to think about not only how can I make more money, but how can I limit my expenses. And I think that I kind of talked about this like three tiers of expenses, and I kind of think of expenses. Maybe it's not three tiers of expenses on, maybe it's three buckets of expenses. That's probably the better way to
Mhm.
put it, because I think that there's kind of like three buckets of expenses, and then all of them vary in expense, right? How big they are. And I think it's kind of finding that combination of what makes sense. For me, the three buckets are, what are my overall like money making expenses? Like these are expenses that I am using that are going to basically make me more money. So,
Yeah.
marketing budget is a big example of that, right? Or like networking events. Those are these events are for me to make more money. Um, Other expenses and buckets I look at as like cash flow expenses. So, what are ways that I'm spending money to optimize cash flow? And what I mean by that is it's not necessarily make me more money. It could be technically do like a great example is what you're doing right now. Like going to the library, maybe it's not an expense, but like it's expense in some capacity, but it's streamlining you. So from that
Mhm.
perspective, like it's an expense that's worth it because it's going to make you more efficient. And then the
Mhm.
last one is asset growing. So like how are we growing the overall business to make it worth something? So from a
Mhm.
perspective, you want to like sell it. So I think it's important to think of expenses in those three buckets to a degree. And
Mhm.
so what I would do is really in the beginning, you're going to want to focus a lot more on the overall, like if you're in your position, overall money making expenses and the cash flow, because like
Okay.
the asset will grow probably like the first asset expense is when you hire your first employee,
Mhm.
because that person, that asset expense, like that's where when somebody asks me like, should I bring on a front desk person? Should I bring on that? Like if you can bring on like a virtual assistant,
Mhm.
that can streamline your schedule so you can make more money that way, and then you can keep your expense really low. That's a really creative way to do that and optimize your schedule, right? And so you
Okay.
can do that. And then that's something. So kind of go back to your original question, and I can get off topic here real fast. For you in particular, where you are in your stage, the first thing I would do is put more money into marketing. I would put
Yeah.
more money into getting more patients, right?
And
And I
that's
would,
and the
yeah, go
I
ahead.
think we talked a lot about like customer acquisition costs,
Yeah.
and you think if you can, especially with the golf program we highlighted earlier, but also even if it's just sponsoring a golf tournament or I don't know, handing out flyers, uh, those things tend to be, if you look at them as an investment, and I put $100 into something and I get $1,000 out, which maybe 5, 10 visits, something like that, that's a no-brainer, right? Um, and especially when I don't have other people. But so that's where I think that customer acquisition cost or cost of acquiring a customer comes in. And obviously, you want to hit home runs every time, but there'll be times where you got to lose it. So that's where I was thinking the answer would go to.
Yeah.
Um, but now you're making me think. Okay, well, how can I streamline?
Yeah.
Right?
But that's good, dude. Like you're thinking about that, right? So like to be honest, this is why social media is such a good thing to crack. And I'll explain something that I would like for me, one of the things that we're trying to do more of is coach business owners into how to understand their own marketing and where their marketing lies and their efficiency, right? Because so many people, there's two steps. I don't know, there's more than two steps, but I would say the two major steps that I see people faltering at
Mhm.
is they're getting better at the first part. Okay, now I know how to. I'm spending money on acquiring customers. I'm acquiring customers. I'm acquiring customers, and then they're kind of like missing that second step, which is like how to get over the hump of okay, now I can bring on more employees or I can scale. And if I'm trying to scale, those problems become different, and that's where efficiency is super key.
Mhm.
Because if you can be more efficient, then what it allows you to do is be more creative and basically just moving money around. Like that's what I do now. I just start like
Mhm.
moving money around. I'm like, well, if I want to do this now, it means I just have to stop doing that. And it means like again, and to the point of the two ways you make more money is one by making more money and bringing more money in, or cutting the expenses, which increases your profit margin.
Mhm.
So basically, what we're talking about is the differences between the two buckets. Because some people might be like, to your point, like, well, yeah, make more money or make more money. Like, what the two different buckets are the same. The make more money is the overall gross revenue. The second bucket is how to optimize profit margin. So if
Yeah.
I'm making, let's take the numbers, make it really round. If I make $10,000
Mhm.
and I'm spending $9,000 in expenses, there may be different programs that are easier to implement that will lower those expenses to $8,000 overall, meaning you can
Mhm.
condense some stuff. So, like, when I look at now, like our company, again, it's like our company's quite a bit larger now, and obviously we have like 15 employees, and that's just the one side in Connecticut, right? That's not even California, Colorado, or Long Island. That's just Connecticut. So if I look at
Mhm.
that, our three biggest buckets that we spend money on are our payroll, so our employees,
Mhm.
right, and payroll taxes. So that's something to think about. Our
Yeah.
marketing, right? So our
Mhm.
marketing, and I mean the third would probably be as I'm kind of scrolling through. I mean, how about this? Those two are far and away the most money we spend on expenses. The next one I'd have to look at, but it's
So.
probably like our EMR and billing, right? So again, like if you think about EMR and billing streamlining,
Mhm.
marketing, getting more patients in the door, and then payroll is kind of that asset. right? So there's like
Yeah.
you have your biggest three in each bucket. Because if I think of the payroll, the more physical therapists we have that are making more money for our business, like right now as I'm sitting on my podcast, our clinics are open making money. So in
Mhm.
theory, that is an asset that's operating without me. Like that makes the
Mhm.
clinic much more valuable. So if you're somebody who's listening to this that eventually wants to sell their practice, you got to get out of the clinic. Otherwise, it doesn't matter, right? If
Yeah.
you're in the fight, so you got to take that next step if that's something you want to do.
Well, that's it. If I'm an investor, you're way more valuable if all I do is change the name on the bottom of the letterhead as opposed to having to come in there and do it all myself. And
Exactly.
I think you bring up a good point. This might be something I want to throw back at you. So we talked about the three tiers, right? So
Mhm.
increase revenue or get that marketing, get more people through the door, streamline or decrease how much you're
Gotcha.
doing with the expenses. And then you touched on assets, which we'll get to more. But would you rather have a $10,000 revenue, $9,000 expenses, or if there's something that would streamline so much but it would also cost you revenue, would you rather decrease what you're getting in revenue with a more streamlined product, right? Like what would be a situation where you would say, okay, one's better than the other?
Dude, I think this is an awesome question. And I'm actually going to trace this back to a little bit more of a philosophical answer. I think it just
Okay.
particularly matters on the person, right?
Okay.
Like for instance, what I'm doing with Evolution and what I'm doing with my partner Mike is essentially growing a gross revenue where like the margin might be smaller than say,
Mhm.
something it could be with individual, but the number of the gross revenue we want to be quite a bit larger. So like
Yeah.
a profit margin, if you're to your point, Elon Musk, right, is thinking about
Mhm.
profit margin, but I don't think he's hurting on profit margin, right? So if his
Mhm.
profit margin is 10% at $1 billion, he's
Yeah.
doing real well, right? Like he's
Yeah.
doing really well. Versus if your profit margin is 10% at 100 grand, that
Mhm.
means you're only making 10 grand a year. And so that's where it's tighter. So I think more so what I think is important for people to understand is like, where do you want to take your business? Right? Where do you want to go?
Yeah.
Do you want to, because I think a big one for most people is if you think to yourself, like the hardest part in my mind of scaling a business is
Yeah.
managing people and creating culture. And that's what's going to be the asset. So I know I have a friend of mine who runs a mental health practice. He's a very awesome therapist who does that. Dude's making 300K a year just himself. So
Mhm.
like for him, he's just like his whole thing is I'm going to collect as much money as I can. I don't have
Yeah.
any overhead other than like my rent, and I can
Yeah.
do stuff online. And I'm just going to put money away, and I'll be retired by 45. Like that's his goal. And I'm like, that's cool. Like to your point, like that's good for him. For me, that wasn't my goal. I wanted to do something a little bit bigger and help more people, and wanted to try and do something like where I could sell it eventually and try and innovate. And that's what I'm doing. So I don't think
Well,
either answer is wrong. I think it's more aligned to what your goals are.
and that's what I think the question really stems from is if you want to be a company of one, decrease the expense, maybe don't work so hard on the revenue because you're not trying to keep the snowball going, right? You're not trying to keep building and building and building. And then eventually when you sell it, yeah, you'll start cutting expenses. But it's different strokes for different folks, right?
Yeah.
There's some people listening to this that just want to be like your friend where they have a very good salary, don't have to pay much, and just keep enough so that your schedule's full.
Yep.
Other folks want to take over the world, or in our world, they want to help as many people as possible in the best way. So, I think that's kind of an important thing to look at,
Yeah. I
because
think
if I'm making an expense decision now as a single therapist, do I flood into marketing knowing I'm not going to make that much money in the next year or two because I want some 4 or 5 clinics, or do I choose, okay, it's working for me, so let's just streamline expenses.
It's a great question, dude. And I think that's exactly how you can evaluate your expenses, right? Like, where do I want to be going? And I love the answer. I ask all sorts of PTs, all sorts of questions like this, like, what's your 5 or 10 year plan, right? What's your
Mm-hmm.
5 or 10 year goal? Because it gives me some insight into what they're doing. And I
Mm-hmm.
think, the cool part about what we're doing here with this podcast is it's one of those things where we can help people with those decisions and make better. The biggest thing about something like what we're doing right now is helping
Mm-hmm.
people make decisions faster. That's how
Yeah.
you win. Because if I can make a decision, the real idea behind entrepreneurship in any capacity is if you're perseverating on an expense, like, I don't know, should I cut this cost? Should I do this? If you make the decision today, I promise you, you'll be better off for it tomorrow. The
Mm-hmm.
difference is if you make this decision, a year from now, that's when that delays growth in either one of
Yeah.
those sectors. So I think more so it's figuring out what you want to do, saying, okay, this is the direction I want to go. and then ultimately you can just dive in either direction. But again, I think, that's where I think ultimately the next piece of that, to your point, is if you're somebody who's just an army of one and I want to grow like that, really
Mhm.
optimizing your expenses for cash flow is going to be important. And on the flip
Mhm.
side, if you're somebody who's like, hey, I want to really have 4 or 5 clinics, I think you really want to dump more stuff into asset growth. And
Mhm.
and again, like, that may take 3 4 years to really grow a lot.
Yeah.
But you'll see the different growth. And then what ends up happening that I have found is all of a sudden you just catch momentum one day and you're like, holy
Yeah.
crap. It's like
Oh,
there's a great Alex Hormozy line that I love. And he's like, if you're trying to do big shit, a lot of times you need to build a bigger foundation. So imagine like a big
mhm.
skyscraper. You wouldn't
Mhm.
just build a little dinky foundation to build this big skyscraper, right?
Mhm.
You'd want to build a giant foundation. So digging that hole is going to take a lot longer. And I love that analogy because I think I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what it's like. It's like if you're going to create a much bigger asset, you're going to need to create a bigger hole and a greater foundation first. So you're just going to need to put in a little more work, and it's just a delayed
Yeah.
satisfaction.
Well, and
But either way,
I love how this basically we were like, oh, we're going to do expense planning,
yeah,
and it comes into like a philosophical debate, but that not debate, but
no,
it's
I know what you
two
mean.
divergent ways of how you're doing it, and I mean that's kind of a big thing to think of as a business person.
Yeah,
Is every daily decision aligning with your long-term goal,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And this is one of those ways of it doing. Marketing will do that obviously because I want to be XPT, YPT, whatever, but also how are you managing your funds? What are you look
yeah.
what is your decision today going to do in a year?
Yeah.
So,
Actually bringing it back to the expenses, the one thing I would do, so say, let's go into the philosophical, like, of those two people. And we didn't even write this
mhm.
down in the pre-show as like to what we would do. So I'm going off script already, behind the curtain, going off script. In terms of,
It's
one thing I
okay.
would say is, I would say if you're going to be an army of one thing
Mhm.
that I would definitely do is I would try and outsource as much as possible. So I try and outsource a lot
Okay.
of stuff, right? So, because if you think about it, the thing about an army of one, if you've ever read the book by Tim Ferriss, The 4 Hour Work Week, one of the things
Mhm.
that he talks about is how to, effectively and efficiently outsource as many things as possible, because that will help with cash flow. Because to
Mhm.
hire employees, right, is going to cost you more money, because it's going to cost you money in payroll, but it's also going to cost you way more money and it's also going to cost you way more money in terms of, like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of a great example, but it's going to cost you way more money, like payroll taxes and things along those lines,
Mhm.
right? And
Yep.
time off and blah blah blah, right? Versus if you hire an employee, right, and you're creating more of an asset, like you hire another physical therapist, and you pay them X amount of dollars, and they can make you 2x on your revenue. Now you're creating that stuff too, and you're creating more of that aspect. So, for me, I think it's an aspect of both those things. I think that's the idea. Is I would really think about your expenses as to outsource versus
Mhm.
it. Now what I look at is, if we were to hire an employee, how would we do it? What would they do? And how would they make us more money in terms of, like, the company, and how would they help the company grow?
Yeah.
If the answer is X, Y, and Z, and they're effective, then we hire that person, right? If we think
Yep.
that, like, hey, they're going to affect, what's different with an employee is, like, we just had this happen where we were interviewing this guy, and, like, it made sense for us to bring him in for this one specific role that he
Mhm.
had credentials for. And I was like, this is awesome. Like, let's bring him in for this. But then very quickly after interviewing him, he's like, I don't really want to do that one part of that job. I'd rather just do just physical therapy and just this. And the reality
Mhm.
is, like, all right, like, that works, because while I was, like, excited to shove him into this role, he doesn't want to
Mhm.
do it. And the reality is, like, that's bad for the culture in general, and that's going to screw me down the road. Right. So
Yeah.
even that
Yeah.
expense immediately, I may have to wait and even lose some income on something just to make sure I get the
Mhm.
right peg. But you got to start thinking about that solution for an asset versus if, like, and again, that's the management of, we can't just people are not robots. I can't just force them to
Uh,
do something that I need them to do. Like, that's massively efficient. So in
yeah.
that sense, like, you're going to want to make sure that you're thinking about that kind of process.
Well, and this is why I think some like solopreneurs really struggle with that first hump of like, I got to get the right employee, right?
Yeah.
And they're worried about hiring, and some of them may have had that experience as a manager. I know a few of the companies that I worked for in a clinic director or a regional capacity, they did it a lot differently, right? So sometimes the clinic manager did basically all of the hiring, and then other times it was done 2 or 3 levels above.
Hmm.
So people might not have that experience to do it. Um, so I think the way you framed it of looking at it as an asset of like you would be buying or investing in real estate, buying a house is about like where you want to live and all that. But if you were putting an investment money down in the stock market, do I think this is something that will grow and help long term versus does it fix my problem now? Right. And it should do both. I mean, ideally, it does both. But I think prioritizing that long term growth is important.
For sure. I
Um,
mean, and
and
I think that it
when you're talking
allows
about
you.
people expenses, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it does is, I did that point, like, kind of being like, you can't force people to do certain things. If you hire somebody to do something specific for you, you can
Mhm,
force them to do stuff because they don't work for you.
mhm.
So,
Yep.
or I should say, like, you're their customer, right? So, like,
Oh,
because
you're
you're
talking
their
about if you
customer,
outsource.
yeah, exactly. So, like,
Yeah.
if I out like we outsource. Great example is, like, we hired an internal marketing person, and it wasn't as effective as outsourcing it. So we
Mhm.
outsourced that marketing group. Now
Yeah.
it probably cost us as much as a salary, but I
Mhm.
can, like, be like, "Hey, this sucks right now. Can you make this better?" Like, I can
Yeah.
do that. Because employees, there's only so many times you can do that before they're, like, out the door.
Yeah.
And if you force somebody in another situation, like, this was a situation I was just talking about, where if we put this employee in place, he would affect negatively some other people too. Like, it wouldn't just
Yeah.
be him. Like, there'd be some other people to accommodate him, would negatively affect some other people. So
Yep.
actually, ironically, we are actually going to have to hire two people to do that job, where it's going to cost us more money, but we're
Mhm.
ultimately going to have a better culture and outcome, which is going to help us long term in the asset growth. So when we
Yeah.
think about it, we're like, we're going to end up growing the overall asset much more efficiently and better, which is awesome. But on the flip side, it's going
Mhm.
to cost us more money up front. So, like, that's how you would have to play the expense game, is how that would work and move it around. Like, with one piece, it's profitable, so you have to constantly be, looking at that process.
Yep.
But that's exactly how you look at, versus if it's a cash flow system. Honestly, in that scenario that I just painted, you would go get the credentials, which is an expense to get the credentials. So this is
Yep.
an ATPT situation. I'd go get
Mhm.
an EMT to do both, right?
Yep.
Like, I would do the
Well, yeah.
EMT, right? And so what I
Yep.
would do is, the expense that I would do, and all of a sudden it made me cash flow better, because now I can take on and I can do two jobs. That's the issue with being an army of one. An army of one
Yeah.
is, you're going to sacrifice a lot of time, because you're going
Yep.
to you're going to truly trade time for money. So it makes sense to go for one to many type of processes, right? So,
Yeah.
like, doing something like that is what you got to do. And I recognize really quickly with kids and what I want to do long term. And honestly, I just want to do bigger shit. So I was like, let me see if I can help more people. And quite frankly, now we do thousands of visits versus I can do tens of visits by myself, right? So I
Well,
think that's the difference.
and I think that's important. Like when you look at the way listening to you talk and listening to how you're talking about people and how this person would affect that, and then if I outsource this, what's the personality clash is going to be, or how do I instruct this person if they're outsourced versus somebody who I have to share a break room with, all of these really but it's all about that's all coming into managing an expense. It's just this
Yeah.
is why it's so challenging. And like you said, when you grow, you have to be good at managing people.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're a solopreneur, you're just basically looking for who can I pay the least amount of money per hour and get the best result. I think you really do have to shift gears when you grow doing that.
Yeah.
Or you just take it all on yourself and then you're working in the business, not working on the business.
Yeah.
So all of this comes into expenses, talking about not just money. How much do I have to pay this outsource guy, or how much do I have to put up with, pay a in-house person, but what are the time costs, right? What are the emotional costs? What are the anxiety costs that take you away from the stuff that we talked about in the beginning of marketing, getting your place out there, building, growing? So when we talk about expenses, I think it's really important for anybody listening to this to understand we're not just talking numbers. It
Yeah.
is very, very much a long thinking business owner, either solopreneur or growth mindset. Both of them should be thinking as expenses as multiple things, not just the money.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I mean, honestly, you know what? Oh, we just kind of thought about another episode we should do, is the stuff about management, because I think managing, we're talking about managing expenses, but managing people, which is the biggest expense that we have at Evolution, right? Is our physical therapy is a very, very heavy employee based business. So
Mm-hmm.
because of that, we need to be taking care of our biggest expenses, our employees. And so it was the number one thing that I did not realize was the most important thing, was management of people. I think, because you have, funny enough,
That
you have more experience in that than I
I
do.
went the other way around. So
Exactly.
I went through the managing people part
Yes.
quickly because someone else was the entrepreneur. right?
Yeah,
So I love hearing you say that because I could talk managing people, right?
exactly.
So in the next episode, we will
I
solve
know. I think it's
management.
great. It's great. And I mean, again, to your point, like that's something I kind of had to learn on the fly because like I did manage some people, but not at the level you
Mhm.
did, right? And that was
Yeah.
now as an entrepreneur with like 15 people. The number
Mhm.
one thing I had to do is learn how to manage people properly, and like I think there's some really good ways to do it, and it has built. But I did kind of look. I went through some pain.
Yeah.
I went through some pain with it.
Call,
I wish I had learned that a
call.
lot quicker, and then reading a lot of books and doing that. We'll go through the
Yeah.
process and like how it works better.
Yeah.
And now it's easier. It's a lot easier because we've
Yeah.
now I learned how to do it. But it is the hidden. There's a
Call.
how about that hidden cost? The hidden cost of turnover, right? Like
Yeah.
for being a
Mhm.
shitty manager and then turning people over, and like, oh my god, what a headache on that front.
Yeah.
So like, there's the other hidden cost, right? So it's like how
Mhm.
to learn that process.
Yeah. Call me when you get to 40.
Yeah, exactly,
That's
man. Exactly. But
awesome.
you know what? I can confidently sit here and tell you that I feel confident in scaling that now. I feel like I'm confident in scaling
Oh,
that
100%.
from 15 to 40 to 100 to 1,000. I feel more
The,
confident in that because
yeah.
now I think that scales nicely because those are
Yeah.
people, and so it's
Yeah.
just and then also managing expectations of certain turnover, like how to do that and
Well,
pipelines.
the principles of running a good clinic are almost identical to running a good region.
Yeah,
And in speaking closely with people who run the VP level and the national level, honestly, it's just different problems.
yep,
It's the same. It's different size of the problems, but it's the same skills. You got to be
for
able
sure.
to talk to people. Anyway, we can go on and we will go on about
We'll
that
do
in
it
one
next
of our
time.
upcoming podcasts.
Yeah,
So thank you everybody for listening. Brian, have an excellent Thursday, my friend.
you too, man. Good talking with
All
you.
right. See you.
I miss that 60 voice. See ya.